Jung Seed Company has a large selection of seeds, plants, and supplies to help get your garden started. Jung Seed is a family-owned and operated company since 1907. Use code 10FINE23 to receive 10% off your order at jungseed.com. That's 10FINE23 at jungseed.com.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants.
But not always the same ones. I'm Carol Collins. I'm Associate Editor at Fine Gardening Magazine.
Hey everybody, I'm Danielle Sherry. I'm the Executive Editor. And we're going to get right down to it today because Carol and I want to record this quick and get out into our gardens. Whee! It's spring, everybody. Well, today's subject, the glamorously titled hole fillers. Carol, tell me what hole fillers are.
I would say that every good garden has holes from time to time, either because something died or because you're waiting to put something big in, or you've put something big in and it hasn't quite grown into its space. But, that's how I came at it was, these things that you can plant that will occupy a space immediately. They're easy to move around. Maybe they're annual, so it's not a long-term commitment. Is that kind of how you were thinking about it?
100%. I actually had a really hard time because most of my hole fillers that I've utilized in my garden and still do are annuals. So I tried to, I did a few laps around the garden to say, okay, all right, yeah, that's actually one perennial hole filler that I did utilize as such. And I'll explain what that one is later on. But yeah, for the most part, for me, it was annuals or, tender perennials, maybe a few. I'm curious to see if you have a dahlia on your list because I was thinking, tubers or something like that would be a good option too.
They would be. I feel like if I talk about dahlias too much, people get sick of it, but they are fantastic, perfect hole fillers because they will take up whatever amount of space you need. You can find one that's the right size. But yeah, I don't have one on my list for today.
Oh my goodness. All right. I did not call it correctly. Well, tell me what you do have on your list. What's plant number one that's your go-to hole filler?
So I have one that it's a perennial and it's a grass, but it's a nice polite sized grass. Prairie dropseed is something that I have added into some vacant spots in my garden in the past, 5 or 6 years. That's Sporobolus heterolepis, and it's hardy from zones 3 to 9. And I like the size of this grass. It gets 2 to 3 feet tall and wide max. And it's just like this sort of nice little cushion shaped grass. Fine foliage. Its native range covers a lot of North America, so chances are, especially if in the north or central part of North America, it's native to where you are, including Connecticut, where we are. It's not a self-seeder. Some of the hole filler grasses that we might think of, like a pennisetum or whatever, they also are notorious seeding about, for seeding about, but this one does not. However, you can grow it from seeds. So if you like it and you want more of it, you can collect those seeds that drop in late summer, and that's why it's called dropseed. Collect some of those, and you can start more plants to fill other holes in the garden. It moves pretty easily because it doesn't have an extensive root system, just a nice little tidy root system, no bigger than the top. Mm-hmm. And it creeps very slowly to the little tuffets that it makes get a little bigger every year, but it's not one of those grasses that runs wildly and will take over a big chunk of your garden. That's not the kind of hole.
Miscanthus right
now. Oh my gosh, yeah, that's not the kind of hole filler I'm generally looking for. That one takes some planning. So the flowers in late summer. The flowers are held well above the foliage, so it's like, a nice little cloud of fragrant too. People describe the fragrance of the grass flowers of Sporobolus as either cilantro or somebody called it popcorn-like.
Oh,
I haven't
two very strange, different.
Yeah, but
different
kind of like a
smells.
nutty smell, I guess is so
Okay.
that's how I would describe it. I don't spend a lot of time out there sniffing it. But it's very pretty. It gets along with other plants, and it's a good matrix plant, but for a lower part of the, low growing part of your
I gotcha.
design. Yeah.
Carol, was that the one that was that the grass that you had gotten almost like a plug tray of these? I thought that a couple episodes you had explained we were talking about a different topic. I can't remember. It's been 100 and whatever topics now, but you had gotten plugs, I think, from maybe Prairie Moon Nursery of something. Was this it?
No, I got Black Hawks. That's the
Oh,
big blue
yes.
stem.
Okay.
But this is available from multiple sources as plugs, and it's it would make a great ground cover. In fact, I think Chanticleer has it as a ground cover over like a field.
Nice,
and
nice.
and it's the Sporobolus meadow, and they maintain it by burning, so you can cover a lot of ground with it. But also, if you just need to fill 3 or 4 square feet, you can stick a few of these in there, and it is great. I would love to get some plugs of this. I haven't done it yet.
Okay, all right, very cool. I like that. I have a grassy type plant that's coming up as well. So I think grasses overall, if you've got some polite, we can say, blanket statement, if you've got, a polite grass that you know of, that they're generally good hole fillers, and you can cut them back and divide them, and generally they're really tolerant of if you want to plant through them as well. If over
Yes.
time they mass out a bit, you can pop things in and along in the matrix. All right, so I won't talk about that grass though. I'm going to talk about my favorite annual hole filler, and it's probably one of only 2 to 3 annuals I ever have grown or will grow in my garden, and that's Cleome. Some people call it spider flower, and it's Cleome hassleriana, and it's cultivars and everything in between. There's so many different colors of Cleome that you can get. You can get mixes where there's pinks and purples and whites. That's a little too daring for me. I prefer to stick to like one color, and generally that's boring white or perhaps purple. And this is an annual, but it is a large annual. This will get 3 to 6 feet tall, depending on how much space and real estate you're able to give it in a season. And it only spreads to about 18 inches wide. So we're talking, kind of a tall, skinnier annual that just is really lovely. Full sun, dry soil, drought tolerant. Really not one of those annuals, which I hate to give annuals a bad rap, but that you have to be out there with the hose every 2 seconds for it to look decent. This is a very, very vigorous annual. It has palmate star-like foliage that's a little bit sticky, but then in each leaf node, is a spike, which, everybody goes, well, why the heck would you want to plant that then? You take your life into your hands when you're like getting in there weeding. But the great thing about it for me is that the deer leave it alone then, and the bunnies and any other critters that might nibble on your plants. Between that sticky kind of fragrant foliage, and then also those spikes that even as young tiny little starts, the critters leave this annual alone. Like I said, it bulks up really quick, and it's all about those flowers, man. Once you get like 3 feet tall and these softball size firework flowers, there's petals that are held on these really long filaments, and that's kind of like the whole thing is made up of that. Think like allium flowers, those giant allium flowers. It looks a lot like that. And Cleome blooms and blooms and blooms and blooms. Like you look at this thing and go, God, aren't you tired yet? And you don't have to supplement with any sort of fertilizer. It just keeps going and going and going. No deadheading, which is great because you don't want to have to wear gloves every time you go after this thing with all those spikes. And it will bloom from late spring, as soon as those little starts. I usually get them as starts. I don't use these as I don't start these as seeds, but you can very easily. Late spring all the way up until frost. it'll still be blooming. The frost will kill it, and you'll see the plant go down with the flowers still intact from that last frost. I will say that sometimes it does self-sow. It's not obnoxious. Think of it like tall verbena. It's one of those plants that, you're lucky, you get a few little babies the next year, easily moved around and easily removed if you don't want them. But this has just always been an annual that I've especially used because I've got a lot of woody plants, as we talked about, in my beds and borders, and I need a sizable annual that is going to bulk up and hold room while those shrubs really get into their own and become their mature sizes. And you can't beat something that flowers basically from April until November. I mean, that's a good one. All right, Carol, next plant, annual, perennial, Muppet.
How about an annual that looks a little like a Muppet? How about that?
Yes, I didn't know this, people. That was the most excellent transition we have ever done on this podcast.
It's not fuzzy or anything, but it's got this. Okay, Snow on the Mountain. Are you familiar with this one? It's Euphorbia marginata, and it is an annual.
Okay, I think so. Like bluey green foliage, like splashes of white around the tops of like the cola area. Okay, go.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Okay. All right. So this is 1 to 3 feet tall. Like I said, it's an annual. It's a native annual. This is cool. It's native to the central U.S. From Minnesota and the Dakotas down to Colorado and Texas. And when I think of annuals, I think of them as being from somewhere else. So it's cool that this one is a North American native. It likes full sun and dry to average soil. It will tolerate poor soil. And I think this is an annual, but I think it from a distance, and especially if you plant it in groups, that it looks like a shrub.
Oh.
And it has these tall stems that are sort of unbranched until it gets up to the top. And that's what makes it look like Muppety, like it's just like this head at the top. The flowers themselves are not really significant. You barely see the flowers. You have to get really close. They're right in the center, little chartreuse things. But around them are these white bracts that make it look like that. Those are the petals of the flower. And then around those are those bluey green leaves that you were talking about. And those start out bluey green, but then as the season progresses, they develop these like gorgeous white margins. And so it's just like, a color like combination that you don't really see that much, and especially in an annual. I think it's really good. The reason I think of it as a whole filler is that it's good with more colorful things, like your more Muppety looking dahlia with the big floofy heads, and then you put a little crisp white Snow on the Mountain near that, and it just sort of cools the whole thing down. But it also goes well with pretty much any color. It's almost like a neutral, fast growing, and I saw this for the first time when I was like brand new to having my own garden. I was in a community garden. I was like 19 years old, and somebody right near the entrance in their plot had this, and I just had to know what it was. And I wanted to grow it ever since. I am growing it this year for the first time. So I'm very excited. And I was also excited that one of our coworkers had had photos of this. So we had, I don't have photos of it in my garden yet, but if you look in the show notes, you can see what this really cool plant looks like.
That's amazing. I took a wild guess at what that plant was because I think it like back in the recesses of my brain, I may have seen it a couple of times, but now it's coming back to me that I think the most recent time that I've seen it is there is a cut flower grower that's nearby my house that I will go in summer and, kind of peruse the fields of cut flowers. And I believe they grow it as a cut flower. Now, euphorbia does create that sap, so be careful when you cut it. And it did have like a little sign of like, don't get the sap on you from this one. But I can recall that I did, take a few snippets, and just like you were saying in the garden, having it in a bouquet was really lovely, and it gets tall. So, you've got a long stem. It really just cools down those vibrant zinnias and dahlias and these other, Muppet-like flowers that you have in there. So I think that's where I've seen it last. Did you come across that people saying it was a decent cut flower, Carol?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I order most of my flower seeds from Johnny's, and it's in their cut flower section. And what's nice about it is it does have those tall unbranched stems, and so it's easy to fit into a bouquet because of that. And then that, head just fits right in, just like it's a huge flower.
That's awesome. That's so cool. All right, and you're growing it obviously from seed this year. How big are your seedlings now?
I just put them in, and we record this a little before broadcast time, but you should sow it 4 to 6 weeks, as much as 8 weeks before your final frost. So I'm doing 4 weeks. I don't really want these to get too big or root bound before I put them out, but I've got them on heat, and we shall see how it goes. You can direct sow these too, and they should grow quite easily from seed, no matter what you do. It's a really rather unfussy plant from everything I've read, so can't wait to see.
Oh, that's exciting. All right, and tell me which euphorbia species it is again.
Euphorbia marginata, and it's annual. It's not one of those, tropical perennials.
Nice. I love it. All right, I'm going. You know what? Let's stay on the native kick. I'm ready to throw out my grass leg plant, and this is a sedge, and it's Appalachian sedge, which is Carex Appalachia. Sorry, is it Appalachia or Appalachia?
I think it depends what part of the Appalachians you come from.
That you come from? All right. So we'll go with Appalachian sedge, and that's zones 3 to 7, B 3 to 8, somewhere around there. This is a grass-like plant, green grassy plant, 12 to 18 inches tall, 18 to 24 inches wide. Sounds very much like your prairie drop seed. Has this very airy, wispy, Kelly green color to it. I don't love sedge flowers. They kind of get like these little weird, like cigar like tuffets that come out generally in late spring, early summer, whatever. I mean, it's not that bothersome. It looks like these little fiber optic things that are floating above the grass. But this is a great hole filler for heavy shade and heavy dry shade too. So, in places where I've had to wait for, my hellebores or my epimediums, which are also really awesome dry shade perennials, it usually takes them a bit to fill out. Those are really nice massing perennials that do eventually fill in dry shade areas beautifully, but it takes a few years. So I've popped in this Appalachian sedge in between to kind of fill in that space, just give some nice greenery, just really give that nice textural, composition. It's really a nice contrast, especially with things like hellebores that are a larger, bolder leaf. You can easily then plant through it, because that's what's happened to me, is that it masses out over time and kind of makes a little colony, really fills in as this nice dry shade ground cover, beautiful plant. But then, I don't want it to take up, a 3x3 real estate. So I've popped into it, all right, I want to stick a hosta in here too. And I want to, pop in another epimedium. And it's really resilient that way. I'm planting right in and, in between the crowns, and no problems whatsoever with it being thuggish and really like crowding out those other ornamentals that I've popped in. It reminds me a bit of the native version. Obviously I haven't said where it's native, but hey everybody, guess what? The Appalachian mountain range, that's where it's native. It really does. It kind of goes all the way down that north to south swath of that mountain range, and on either side a little bit as well. But it reminds me a bit of Mexican feathergrass in its look and its appearance, and that's Nacella, but it's not slightly invasive like Mexican feathergrass can be in some areas. And also, in a lot of the country, Mexican feathergrass isn't hardy because that's like a zone 7B to 8. So it really, it's not going to come back for us. But it's so for shade instead of sun, not really invasive like Mexican feathergrass can be, and also just bone hardy, which is great for those of us in cooler zones. So that's Appalachian sedge. Yeah, it's just a green grass, but it's got a great texture. It's a tough as nails perennial, and it's a great hole filler for dry shade. All right, third time's a charm, Carol. What's your third plant?
All right, this one is another annual, not native. Well, I'm looking. I forget where the straight species is native to, but is strawberry fields gomphrena. And I am trying to remember. I do not think I have talked about this one on the podcast, but I do think I've shared it on our Fine Gardening Instagram feed. And this has become one of my very favorite annuals. It is so easy and it is so cool looking. So it's small. It gets like 2 feet tall and about a foot wide, individual plants. This is another one that I like to plant in groups to give it a little more impact. Full sun, moist to dry soil. It needs well-drained soil. That's the one thing it's a little fussy about. You cannot plant it where it's too wet. But this is one that you would plant indoors 8 weeks before the last frost because it takes 85 to 100 days to mature.
Oh,
but
macaroni.
Yeah, but it's not insignificant as a hole filler in the meantime.
Okay.
And you can, giving it that 8 weeks head start indoors means that by the time you're putting it out, you've got a nice little plant that once it gets its roots into the ground, it will really take off. Nice strappy foliage, olive green, with, especially as the season progresses, it gets kind of silvery. And then when it starts to flower, sort of mid to late summer, the flowers themselves, again, is very insignificant, like the euphorbia, the true flowers, but they're a compound flower and it has these red bracts, and literally the little flower heads look like strawberries. And the flowers themselves look like the little yellow seeds. Covers the plant. Deer mostly leave it alone. I had the deer take a couple chomps, and then I think they decided, this one isn't as good as the other stuff she has.
Let me move on to the prime rib.
But it doesn't. They didn't even eat the whole plant, and the plant did grow back. I was mad because it meant later flowers even than I was expecting. But I grew, and the other thing about this that I think really makes it sort of, dear to my heart is that the first time I grew it was the summer of 2020, which what a weird summer that was. And we're trapped at home and we don't know, the world seems like it's ending. But this little flower made me feel so cheerful. I had it out next to the mailbox and I'd go out and get the mail and I'd say,
that was the big entertainment of the day, right? Like when we got to go out and get the mail.
Exactly. Felt, almost naughty to get that close to the perimeter of your homestead. But yeah, so that's, I think, part of why it's just lodged in my heart. But I'm growing it again from seed I collected. And I have found that it comes true from seed. I've also found that mice love to eat the seeds. So if you're storing them in the basement like I was,
in a locked container,
you got to keep the mice off from it somehow. They would drag it behind something and eat the little seed heads.
Oh, well, I guess they got to eat too.
That's
So,
true.
so Carol, those little other gompphrenas that I'm familiar with, which I think is like Purple Crush or Fireworks, they're straw-like. They're very that bract is like a straw flower. It's just very it's dry. It's like an everlasting, right?
It is, yes. You can, and these also make great cut flowers. They hold a long time in the vase, and then you can also cut them, hang them upside down. You strip the foliage, and those seed heads last for years, like literally years. I have some from not last summer, but the summer before.
Wow.
Yeah, and then when you get tired of them, just throw them in the garden bed where there's a hole, and you might get some seedlings the next year. I definitely have had a few volunteers, but it's not obnoxious.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. I mean, what more could you ask from a hole filler, right? So it fills the space, gives you flowers. It's easy to collect the seed. It can be used as a cut flower. It can be used as an everlasting. I mean, yeah, that might be the winner of the episode because that's the hole filler that just keeps on giving. Definitely. All right, here's one that doesn't keep on giving, and I'm gonna get so much flack for, but I feel like when you're first starting your garden is when, or a new garden is when, you rely on hole fillers the most. It might be just because, you're trying to keep costs down and, all right, let me get a few of like my choice, perennials or shrubs in place. And then, I really got to spend my money on mulch at this point. So I was just thinking about cheap and easy hole fillers, things that you can find everywhere. And I'm going to throw a bone to creeping petunias, surfinias, supertunias, even million bells, which are really calibrachoas. That's a little bit different, but it's a mini petunia. Um, I'm not a fan. Let me be clear. I am not a fan of these plants. I never have grown them in a hanging basket. Me and hanging baskets don't get along all that well, probably because I'm a terrible waterer. But in the ground, a creeping petunia is basically the equivalent of an ever blooming ground cover. If you can get it established in full sun and you make sure that it's in, moist, well drained soil, or you're giving it a drink every so often, a 4-inch, or a 3.5-inch pot that you picked up for a couple bucks will spread 2 by 2, 3 feet by 3 feet, and really eat up a ton of real estate. Start blooming in mid to late spring and go all the way through frost, without much intervention from you. Because the claim to fame of these, supertunias and surfinias is that you don't need a deadhead. They kind of just crinkle up on their own and fall off basically. And especially on the ground, you don't notice as much. I think that if it was a hanging basket hanging in your face and it's dropping some blossoms here and there, that's kind of a mess and it annoys me. But in the ground, not so much. So I would say stick some petunias, and I've done this. I'm not a huge fan, but I have done this because I was looking for a cheap and easy way to fill some real estate so the garden didn't look, completely barren, especially through those spring and summer months. You're entertaining, you need to fill in some holes. And I tend to go towards, again, the whites and the purples. I think in the show notes, I put in one that was, it's called Surfinia Blue. It's more of, kind of that Nepeta flower color, a bluey purple color. So again, too, it does really well because it matches in with a lot of my other, perennials, Baptisia, Nepeta, that are already, kind of giving me that same color. You can give it a shot of liquid fertilizer, especially in warmer locations. These guys tend to bloom themselves silly and bloom themselves out sometimes. So you might want to, give it a shot of liquid fertilizer. An organic liquid fertilizer is fine at the, August point if you want it to go all the way into November. But yeah, I mean, I know I'm going to get letters. People either love or hate petunias, I think. And I've always been I don't really love them, but I definitely don't hate them. And I think used in this application, they can be really beneficial.
Yeah, I love how they smell. That's if you
Yes.
put me in a greenhouse full of petunias, that's like a happy place.
Yes, you're
Yeah.
right. And they do. They have this beautiful, some people have described it as like root beer smell. It's like that kind of sweet, but not sicky sweet, fragrance to them. So good call, Carol. And it's a lovely, cheap hole filler that smells delicious. All right, Carol. So hole filler for sun or for shade this time around?
This one is full sun to partial shade, and it's a
Nice.
perennial.
Oh, okay.
So this is pink cotton candy betony,
Okay.
and it's Stachys officinalis pink cotton candy, hardy from zones 4 to 8. So many people can grow it. It's nice and small. That's why I think this one's a good hole filler. It gets 2 feet tall and a little more narrow than that, like maybe 16 or 20 inches wide for an individual plant, and it likes. average, poor, or fertile soil. Really doesn't matter as long as it's not, it should be acidic to neutral. So you can't have it in the alkaline soil. Other than that, pretty unfussy. Its native ranges in Europe and Asia. So, I'm not 100% into the native plants all the time. And this I think of as like a benign non-native because it really doesn't seed around too much. But it is a great plant for pollinators. Despite not being native to this continent, our pollinators totally know what to do with it. So this is a plant that's on the June 2023 cover of Fine Gardening. And we didn't have the plant ID in the article, and we got letters. People want to know, what's that light pink one? They recognize humolo, which is related, another betony, same conditions, same everything. But they wanted to know what's the light pink one. I asked the author, the designer, and she said she's like, I hate to admit it, but this was a lucky accident. It came mixed into a flat of humolo. And she's like, I can't give you she couldn't guess. She didn't want to guess. So I knew who could guess, and that's Richard Hockey from the Chicago Botanic Garden. And we just happened to have another reader question I needed to reach out to him about for our letters page. And he recognized it because it was his introduction.
This is a great behind the scenes magazine story.
Yeah, it's pretty few and far between where I feel like a real journalist, but this was like, I tracked this story down. I was like, Richard, what is this? And he said, I was going to ask if that was pink cotton candy. And he said he thought it was because of the colors of the bloom and the size of it, and everything was right. So we ID'd it in the letters page as pink cotton candy. And he said in the article on the Stacky's trial, he said that this is, an argument for not deadheading, because it was just a chance seedling that came up, from the other Stackies that he was trialing. And it was, just a spontaneous cross, or I don't know if it was maybe a mutation, but yeah. But such a pretty flower. It's just this, cotton candy is a great description. It's sort of a compound flower on a little spike, and it's a mix of sort of lighter pinks and slightly darker pinks. And it looks great with humolo. So, and I've actually been growing this plant for a few years and humolo in a different location. And after I was on that photo shoot, I came home, I dug them out, and I mixed them together in a bed. And I don't think I'm the last person that's going to copy this combo.
Yes.
But it really does add something to both of them to see them together. Absolutely. From a color perspective.
That color too, which is funny because, okay, so you've got that kind of like a brighter magenta-y pink from humolo, like a purpley pink. And then you've got the pink cotton candy, betony, that you were just talking about. And then thrown into the mix was butterfly weed, Asclepias, which is bright orange. And on any other planet, I would have been like, you can't throw those three colors together and make it look good. It's shockingly beautiful.
It really is.
Stunningly beautiful. I feel like if you haven't already, Carol, you have to put that cover shot in the show notes for the podcast, because people need to see it. It's just so beautiful. If you didn't see the cover, it's stunning. It is stunning.
Yeah, a great use of not just natives, but Sabrina calls them purposeful plants, things that really have value to the ecological value of your garden, and also beautiful and pollinator value. Yeah, it's a really cool combo. Yeah.
And Sabrina, we're mentioning Sabrina. It's Sabrina Schweier. She was the designer of this cover garden that you'll see on issue, I believe it was 211, right, Carol?
Yes.
Issue 211. And you'll find the plant IDs in issue 212. And now you will also find the plant IDs and the photo on the podcast show notes. Go to finegardening.com. Click on that podcast tab. You'll see the plant list and photos of all the plants that we and our expert talk about today. All right, I'm gonna bring it on home with a whole filler that I have not used, but I have a good friend, Katie, who uses this as a whole filler. She had created a shade garden several years ago and really like had her heart set on larger hostas, the Francis Williams, the guacamoles of the world. But as we all know, those bulky hostas, they take a few years to really bulk up into something. First year they kind of sleep, second year they creep. Even by third year, they don't really leap. Like you need 4 or 5 years for those giant hostas to really become giant. So I had gone over one day, and this is, partial shade to full shade, and she had integrated in and amongst some Solomon seal and painted ferns, some caladiums, which is what I'm going to feature as a whole filler. Now, caladiums are zones 9 to 11. There's many different cultivars of them and many different colorful variations, but for better or worse, they are a 1 to 2 feet tall and wide, tuberous, tender perennial. Think of them like a begonia, treat them like a begonia. And they have these long spade-like leaves, a la elephant ears, miniature elephant ears. But the leaves are almost tissue paper-like in their texture. And they generally have a base color. The one that I put in the show notes is called White Christmas. So the base color of the leaf is actually shocking white. And all the veining and stippling on the leaf is dark green. So you get that beautiful color combination on each one of the leaves. And it kind of has a similar vase shape as an elephant ear. So it's like these mini elephant ears and really bulks up extremely quickly within one time frame, within one season. Plant it out when, the threat of frost is over. You can plant it as a tuber. A lot of times you'll also find this as, like a 6-inch annual, quote unquote, even though it's a tender perennial. At the, in the container gardening section, I'll say, wherever you find like a lot of the elephant ears and such is where you'll find these plants. And you can completely lift the tubers out of the ground if you're not in zones 9 to 11. If you're in a colder zone like we are, zone 6, you can go in, and after the first frost hits and it's kind of wilted back, you go in, you lift those tubers out, you store them in a dark, dry spot, away from mice, because mice also like those. And then you can replant the following year, even get them started inside a little bit early if you wanted to, so they bulk up quicker. You can get it in pinks and greens. There's one that's called Miss Muffet, which is just this Technicolor dream coat of pink, white, green, light, like celadon color. It's crazy. It's a very exotic looking one. I tend to like the ones that are a little more muted. This White Christmas is just a lovely addition and really plays nicely. And if you think about it, like you can plant them out a few times, and then by the time your hostas fill in, you're lifting those tubers and you can put it in another direction, or in another spot that you need to fill holes, or into a container for that matter. So I think it's hard to sometimes find bulky whole filler annuals for shade. So this was just one that I thought would be a really nice alternative for people. And a shout out to Katie, who gave me that idea. She's an excellent gardener. I'm just going to say one little caveat that caladiums are toxic. So if you've got kids or pets that like to chew on plants, then don't plant this plant or keep it away from the kids and the pets. I kind of want to try and plant them and see if it'll start taking care of my deer population. But that's a different story for another podcast. And now, because everything sounds better with a British accent, here's Peter with an ode to spackling paste.
For many of the years that I worked as a book editor, my efforts focused on manuscripts related to home building. Framing, roofs, walls, ceilings, you name it. If it had to do with sheetrock or 2x4s, chances are I read and marked up a chapter or two about it. So you'll forgive me if the first thing that popped into my mind when hearing today's topic, whole fillers, was spackling paste, also known as spackle or taping compound. Yes, I've even edited a chapter about the art of filling holes inadvertently punched into drywall. Why on earth would the gardening folks be doing a podcast about spackling paste, I wondered. But it is not my job to speculate on such mysteries. Now that I've listened to Carol and Danielle educate us on the wonders of certain plants' ability to inhabit temporary spaces within the landscape, I feel a bit silly going on with my dialogue about the history of spackling pastes. Although, did you know that an early version of that multi-purpose material was day-old porridge that would dry to the consistency of concrete? No, I'm too embarrassed to go on. But let me tell you this. If you stumbled upon this podcast episode perchance while looking for a home improvement lesson, might I recommend the book Drywall, Hanging and Taping, Professional Techniques for Great Results by Myron R. Ferguson. Drawing on my years of experience as a painter and decorator, more about that some other time perhaps, I did in fact edit the whole book, and the chapter on spackling paste is pure magic, even if I do say so myself. As much as a substance resembling day-old porridge can be magic, I suppose.
Leave it to Peter, who worked for many years for a fine home building magazine, to somehow get home building into our plants podcast, Carol. I mean, come on.
I know, really. This is fine gardening.
The nerve. Hey, listen, did our expert talk about home building or plants?
Plants, and she has some good shrubs mixed in with her hole fillers.
Oh, I can't wait to see what she has to talk about.
My name is Lisa Bauer. I am from Chartreuse Landscape Design in Seattle, and today I'm going to share with you my favorite hole fillers. These are plants that you can use to either fill a space quickly, or you can use them as a placeholder and move them around easily later, or they're just going to fill a hole and sit there nicely and do their job and not spread wildly out of control. Here we go. My first plant is Sambucus nigra black lace or black lace elderberry. This plant is very useful if you have a new landscape and you need a quick screen or need a larger scale plant to give a young garden some substance before other things grow in. It grows in zones 4 to 7. It likes sun, medium to wet soil, can tolerate clay, but I've also found that it's really adaptable to shadier and drier situations. Mine is on the east side of my house in sandy soil and grows mostly in the shade, and it still blooms. It's a fast grower, maturing at about 6 to 8 feet tall and wide, can fill up a big hole and become a screen for an area needing privacy, or if you have a bare fence and need something to soften the view quickly. I use it when I want to hide things like downspouts or utilities on the side of a house. It's deciduous, but it does become very sort of densely multi-branched, so it can obscure a view even when the leaves aren't there. I tend to prune mine from the base and keep it more vase-shaped. What I like most about it, though, is that the lacy leaves are a dark purpley black, and the blooms are a light, clear pink. The combination is absolutely striking, and I've never had a client that does not like this plant. It also transplants really well. I have moved mine more than probably 4 times, and I've pruned it really hard, and it is still alive and well. So I can really attest to the toughness of this plant. Pieris japonica cavatine, or Cavatine lily of the valley shrub, is my next plant. By contrast, this is a go-to hole filler because it stays compact and grows slowly, maturing at 2 feet high and 3 feet wide. It is evergreen and maintains its rounded habit, so you don't need to do much pruning. It works well as a fill-in anywhere you need year-round bones, like next to perennials such as hosta, ferns, or brunneras. I use it to plug holes under trees or tall shrubs, usually in the background, but it can also be used to plug holes in the front of the border because it's very low growing. I also like this pieris's blooms. The tiny bell-shaped flowers are optic white, and they stand up above the dark green foliage in the early spring and really stand out nicely in a shady area. Pieris do prefer acidic soil, good drainage, and like to dry out slightly between waterings. This one is easy to transplant because it's petite. Dark green is such a good hole filler color because it goes with everything. I use this everywhere or anywhere I need a small bit of evergreen foliage. Juniper squamata blue star or blue star juniper is my third whole filler. It's a conifer growing in zones 4 through 8 and prefers sunny, well-drained soils. I like this plant because it's readily available in fine nurseries, but also can be found at big box retail stores. It's relatively small, maturing at 2 feet tall and 3 feet wide. I use it in dry soil locations where I need a good, bulletproof weed squelcher or placeholder. Its needle-like leaves are super dense and are a nice light gray-blue color. The tips are slightly lighter, giving it a great rough textural effect. As it matures, the branches reach out and it becomes more irregular in shape, but you can prune it back gently to keep it tidy. You can use it to plug one hole or use many to create a nice pattern. I use it on parking strips where there's not a lot of water and where it can be forgotten. It looks great with plants that have a lot of movement, like grasses or among sprawling sedums, yuccas, and tall perennials. This plant is almost bulletproof, and it is a great hole filler that will stake out its territory and not let anything grow in its footprint. The blue color is also a good contrast to many other plants. My fourth hole filler is Bergenia cordifolia Bressingham White, also known as pig squeak. There are lots of Bergenias. Most of them are in the category of pinks that I call Pepto-Bismol pink, so I tend to default to this white one, which I like a lot. Bergenia grows in zones 3 to 8, preferring moist, well-drained soils in sun to part shade. I see it growing commonly on rockeries, in wet clay soils, or almost anywhere. It's an incredibly hardy plant, and I use it to plug holes in containers, along the sides of pathways, under shrubs where I need big, waxy foliage, or in the sun next to tiny leaved ground covers. This plant has such flamboyant leaves that it makes a good contrast next to most any plant. If you like a hardy tropical plant palette, it looks very lush and tropical. It's no problem to dig it up and move it, and it does spread, but not wildly, so you can propagate it easily if you have other holes to fill. I like this particular cultivar because when its white flowers come out in the early spring, the centers are a deep mauve, which creates a nice polka dotty pattern with multiple blooms on one stem. The flowers later fade to all white and sit tall about 6 to 9 inches above the foliage. The only caution is that in the Pacific Northwest, sometimes I see weevils will chew the edges of this plant. I find this happens mostly in drier areas on rockeries where there may not be an optimal water supply. But those leaves are easily removed and new ones pop up in their place. On balance, this is a very valuable hole plugger. My last hole filler is Hepatica nobilis or Liverleaf. It is a slow-growing, native, semi-evergreen perennial that is a great tiny hole filler. It grows slowly, 6 to 9 inches wide over several years and tops out at 4 inches tall. It is the sweetest plant in my garden. Mine is growing happily in shady, moist soil just outside the canopy of some large shrubs. It is a non-aggressive, clump-forming plant, which is what I look for in a hole filler. I bought it because of its great foliage. The leaves are trilobed, shiny, and stand straight up on their skinny, wiry stems. The flowers were a big bonus. I have noticed that on my plant, the flowers have changed from a deep purple blue to a pale purple this year, but they are so sweet and just what is needed in April in the Northwest. Each flower has several rings of little white stamens that radiate from the flower centers. I have never done anything special for this plant, and every year it delights me with its new shiny foliage and delicate blooms in the early spring. It has seeded only once in over 10 years, which was a welcome discovery. You can dig up this plant easily because of its small size and move it to another location. And once it's big enough, it can be divided and moved around. I would plant it in a hole on the edge of a border where you can see it. It can be a specimen, or you could get several to plug into many holes to create a pretty patchwork. This plant has literally sat in one place for years and place holds. It really behaves itself, and that is one of my most important criterion for a good hole filler.
Carol, shrubs as a hole filler. I'm shocked. I am shocked.
I love that black lace sambucas. That was on my list before she had it, but I let her have it. She did a great job with that one.
Oh my gosh. Love it, love it, love it.